I think we have a few minutes for questions. There's a microphone here in the front of the room. If you have a question, please come up to the microphone and so the whole room can hear you.
Have you ever spoken to the National Association of Human Resource Managers, or to see if when you drew that circle and it talked about their productivity and the people they can draw from for filling job slots, it just seems like that should be an important issue for a lot of businesses, in particular that particular group of people.
It's a great question, and unfortunately, when the companies will do surveys of the workers will say congestion is a terrible problem. It hasn't filtered into the human resource departments yet. They're still processing employment applications, as opposed to thinking about how do we expand our labor market. We talk to the CEOs, they understand it, after we sit down with them for 15 or 20 minutes. And interestingly enough, these kinds of relationships are fairly well established in the planning literature, though the planners don't always admit it. And they're also fairly well established in some of the academic work that's been done looking at the relationships between labor markets and productivity at the urban level. So there's actually a lot of work that people like me and others in the room have to do to explain how these relationships work to those that actually have to face the practical problems of dealing with getting workers to their jobs and elsewhere.
When I was on the King County Council, I had enormous frustration at trying to get the transportation planners to look at things that they weren't accustomed to looking at. And here's several. One, that freight is different. Just-in-time inventory processes and the way we manage freight and the amount of global trade and the connections to ports has fundamentally changed the rules of the game. And the freight industry does not want to be separated from passenger vehicles because they fear that they will lose that political support. And this has frozen our decision-making process. The second thing is local governments are prohibited from building, typically, limited access roads. And that means everybody with commercial property wants to stick their straw into the system. And they put the straw at the very place that confounds traffic flow. And those are just two examples. There's lots of other examples of issues that are difficult to measure, so we just don't. And, you know, just last week, 2 transportation planners at King County won a lawsuit because they said they were retaliated against by the county because they generated some numbers that reflected badly on quadrant. And 20 years ago, I raised those exact issues. It's actually 15 years ago. It's a 15-year-old problem because data that was embarrassing to a particular developer was put under the rug, and the transportation planners were punished because they dared to tell the policymakers what was really going on. And they won their lawsuit last week. And so the unfortunate thing is that political agendas and powerful development interests are confounding and making far more difficult our transportation planning. And if we don't address that, we're not going to solve the problem.
It's a really good point. Go ahead. And I think this is actually the frustration, not just here, but nationwide. I mean, one of the things we find is a lot of resistance is just putting more money or giving more money to a Department of Transportation or whatever, because we don't know where the money's going to go, and we don't know if it's going to go to the right projects. Another thing that we think is very important that pricing does is that it creates transparency in the mechanism for prioritizing projects and where the money goes. So if you priced the 520 bridge, there should be, again, we have to make sure we have this in the process. You ought to be able to track where that money goes. I mean, how much money is being collected at that toll, and then where is that money being spent? That kind of transparency doesn't exist in a non-priced environment because it all gets sort of diffused in the budget, which is allocated in all sorts of very weird ways through normal budgeting. So in order for us to move forward, I think we need to have that transparency. And I see pricing really having an important role to play in that. What we find is that once people have confidence that their money is going to go into infrastructure that they think is going to benefit them, they're even willing to raise taxes to fund it. But without it, you don't get that.
So, let's just do these last few questions, and then we'll wrap up as close to 9 o'clock as possible. Thank you.
On the congestion issue, have you taken into consideration that, and following up with human resources, that many companies are working 4-10 work weeks, and that many people now are able to work from home and network into their offices? Does that planning or what you're talking about today take those factors under consideration?
Yeah, those are, in many ways, those are essential, because what that does is that even further limits the utility, the usefulness of looking at transportation or travel in the context of commuter travel. Because what that means is if I'm only working 4 days a week, that means I've got 3 days where I'm able to devote my entire time to other kinds of travel, which have nothing to do with sort of standard commuting. So in fact, what all those trends are doing are reinforcing the need to move to the spider web concept.
Well, is the congestion based upon rush hour time? I know in LA it's not. I mean, that's all the time. But in most urban centers, isn't the congestion issue based upon rush hours? And if they're working 4-10 work day weeks, and if they're working from home on the computer, doesn't that lessen the congestion that we're talking about?
It can lessen, but it doesn't get anywhere nearly close to where you need if you're going to go to the point where it's significantly reduced. Most of what happens is sort of an interesting thing that we looked at. Most transportation plans for regions reduce the rate of growth in congestion. They actually don't reduce congestion. So while those are improvements, and those will help manage the system, it doesn't go anywhere close to what's necessary to really try and grapple with it.
You spoke a lot about road transportation, but here in Seattle and of course in many other regions, we are blessed with a lot of water. How do you think marine transportation fits into your vision for the 21st century?
Bridges.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and I'll be honest that we do not focus a lot on water in our book. However, it is part of it. I mean, one of the important things is what the concept here is trying to create as many connections as possible in order to speed up movement from point A to point B. So in fact, in a place like Seattle, as it is in Manhattan, ferries, water-based transportation is a critical component of that. And that throws a new wrinkle into it. But still in the Seattle area, you're still talking about mainly a road-based solution to these problems. So it's important, certainly more important in this area than, say, Houston. But it doesn't change the logic, it doesn't change the rationale, and it really doesn't change the numbers in a significant way.